Chapter 5. As they cycled along Route 81 the next morning, Jessica was starting to wonder if riding together was a good idea. It had seemed simple enough when she had asked him if he wanted to join her. It looked like a lot of fun when they discussed it while they were busy turning walls into powder. But now, barely hanging onto his speeding back wheel as he hammered across the ridge top, she was gasping for breath and struggling to keep up. On the bright side, she thought to herself between gulps of water, being behind him does have one big advantage. She was getting a great view of his gyrating, pulsating posterior, and his fantastic set of legs. To keep her mind off the pain of lactic acid that was building in her own body, she started examining David's legs closely. Many serious cyclists shave their legs, but David obviously is not a member of that crowd. His calves were perfectly chiseled, with an almost heart-shaped upper layer. Jessica could feel herself about to start overheating in a way that had nothing to do with the exercise. She could, she supposed, ask him to back off, but that was not going to be her first option. Jessica virtually always rode by herself, so having to try to ride at another person's pace was a challenge to her. She also found herself feeling more than a little bit competitive, and was not at all interested in showing Mr. Something Garotha that she was easily left behind. The pair dropped off of the ridge top and down a long, steep hill that lasted about a mile. The highway was nearly deserted, which is one of the main reasons that Jessica liked to ride on this road. They reached the bottom of the hill, and started the first big climb. David's throbbing, jackhammer legs returned to a steady pace as they started upwards, but soon Jessica noticed that the pace was getting considerably slower than she usually kept up this hill. Was David feeling all right? She wondered. She watched his body language closely, and her experienced eye noticed no signs of distress. The thought suddenly hit her, he's fast on the flats, but not on the hills. I can out-climb him. Suddenly, that competitive part of her being decided that it was payback time for making her suffer back down the road. On your left, she called out, passing him using the universal call for cyclists. She put the power into the pedals, and settled into the long climb at a lot higher tempo. Here you are, Mr. Something Garotha, she thought. Let's see you keep up with this. David Miller would have enjoyed the view of Jessica's behind better, if he weren't panting so hard trying to keep up. David had been enjoying the ride up until this point, keeping up a good strong pace. Jessica, who was obviously fit, was staying right on his heels back there on the ridge, so he kept pushing the pace, trying to find a level comfortable to both of them. She is, David thought, in much better shape than I am. He knew, after a couple of minutes of climbing, that there was no way he could keep up with her at this pace on this hill, so he decided to just slow down and climb it at his own pace. Slowly, Jessica pulled away, and as she topped the hill she turned back to see where David was. Had he been looking, David would have seen the surprised and satisfied look on Jessica's face, as she pulled over to the side to wait for him to arrive. The couple reached their predetermined turn-around spot, an intersection of two rural highways 12 miles out of Riverton, and they stopped for a minute to drink water and take a rest. You are one heck of a climber, Jess. Jessica flashed a dazzling smile out from underneath her helmet. She enjoyed both the compliment and the fact that he was feeling comfortable enough to call her by an informal name. You could have lost me on the flats if you pushed it a little, she replied. You've got great legs, she said, quickly adding, I mean you have great legs for cycling. I mean, well, you know what I mean. Your legs are pretty good too, he said, thinking that the rest of this woman was pretty darned attractive too. Jessica looked at her watch, and said it's getting to be time to head back, and you know what we used to say when we were kids, don't you? Not really, David responded carefully to the playful tone in her voice and wicked look in her eyes. She clicked her foot into her pedal and powered off, leaving him standing there still holding his water bottle in hand. As she sped quickly off, she turned and shouted, last one home is a rotten egg. David pushed her hard and actually left her behind on 2 different occasions on the way back, but he knew that he was going to get to be Mr. Rotten Egg. There was absolutely no way under the sun that he could keep up with her on the climb up to his house. Jessica laughed delightedly, standing water bottle in hand as David struggled up the last bit of the climb to Riverview House. He swung his leg off the bike without quite collapsing, and she gave him a big round of applause. Bravo, she said, that hill is a killer. Almost the only people who can climb that he'll do it on mountain bikes. David looked at her and gasped, "But you climb it on that racing bike every day," and he was rewarded by a large, lovely smile in return. "Well, I did say almost everybody who can climb it, didn't I? I hate to beat the pants off of you and run," she said with a playful chuckle, "but I have got to get changed and get to work. I am going to be late as it is. Is it all right if I take the book with the pictures of the house with me to get some decorating ideas out of it?" she asked. "Sure," he said. "Then, with obviously careful phrasing, why don't we get together for lunch, and we can talk about what you think the house should look like inside?" Jessica thought for a moment, and said, "Well, it's Thursday. I can't really do lunch today. I have a previous appointment." David nodded, remembering all too well that she was dating a rich, handsome lawyer. "You know," Jessica continued with a look that made David feel a lot like a fish that had just found out the worm had a hook in it, "you could join me for lunch, and then perhaps we could talk afterwards." "She's up to something," David thought to himself. "Well," he replied, "do you think that is appropriate? I don't want to barge in on your appointment with somebody special or anything." Jessica scanned David's face with an appraising look, and said, "I think it will be just dandy. Meet me at the Pudgy Pigeon downtown at noon. My treat." Before David could answer, she turned and headed for the house to grab the book. The Pudgy Pigeon turned out to be a home-style restaurant located in Riverton's downtown business district. David got directions from Arnie Cox, and after checking himself in the mirror for the 6th time decided that he looked good enough to go. After putting in a good morning's work tracing and checking the condition of the plumbing in the basement, he had traded his working attire for a comfortable pair of business casual slacks, a short-sleeved polo shirt, and a decent pair of shoes. Checking his watch, he decided to arrive 15 minutes early so as to not keep Jessica waiting on him. Downtown parking was not one of Riverton's strong points, he thought as he walked nearly 2 blocks to the restaurant. Early as he was rather surprised to see Jessica waiting for him by the establishment's door. She was wearing a long pleated skirt with a subtle, luxurious-looking weave, a pinstripe long-sleeve shirt, and comfortable walking shoes, and had a camera bag hanging over her left arm. "You clean up nicely," she said with a smile, gulping down the good-looking drink of water walking towards her. "We are a few minutes early, but we can go right on back." Jessica led David in the front door, and they walked past tables set to both sides of a center aisle. Booths lined each wall of the establishment, which was decorated in a modernized rendition of a steamboat parlor. Without stopping at the tables, she walked through a door at the rear of the main seating area into a smaller room filled with long tables and chairs. 2 white-clad women were busily carting in a buffet dinner. "Welcome to the weekly meeting of the Riverton Businessmen's Club," she said with an evil smile. "I thought it was time that you met your neighbors. I don't know if you wanted to meet them, but I am pretty darn sure they want to meet you." David knew that she had pulled one over on him, but he took it like a good sport. He smiled and said, "You just remember, Miss Nosy Pants, you are buying." Jessica directed him to a couple of spots on the end of the far table. The room started to fill with mostly mature men and women, and as they entered she told him about the organization and some of the people who made the good works happen. "The paper pays my membership, and I usually get a couple stories a month out of the meetings. This club does a lot of good things. We built both the new softball and baseball fields, and we helped develop a family care center at our women's shelter, and other things like that. The people that will be in this room are the movers and shakers of the community." As the locals entered the room, David noticed several people staring at him and Jessica, while engaged in hushed conversations with old friends. Jessica sat waving and saying hello to people as they entered, apparently oblivious to all of the sets of eyes staring at the two of them. Slowly, she explained in a quiet tone and discreet gestures about some of the town's most important and influential people as they entered the room. "There's the mayor over there, and that lady next to him is his biggest political rival in town. They are brother and sister, and man do they have some knockdown, drag-outs. He's the director of the nursing home, and that woman over there is the superintendent of our schools." Slowly, the tables started filling up, but nobody sat within 2 chairs of David and Jessica. Suddenly, a bell rang, and those assembled stood. Jessica quickly told her guest that the routine was a prayer by one of the ministers in the club, then the Pledge of Allegiance. Afterwards, everyone made a trip through the buffet line and returned to their seats with heaping plates. After the meal, Jessica explained, somebody would present a short program on some local issue or hobby. The food smelled excellent, and both David and Jessica tore into it with the legendary appetite of a cyclist. As David was trying very hard not to shovel in a mouthful of mashed potatoes and gravy, he heard Jessica give off a short, involuntary gasp. He quickly looked over at her face, which was staring intently towards the doorway. Turning his head to follow her gaze, his eyes settled on a dashing man of about David's age in a very expensive suit walking, who was making an entrance into the room. "I am sorry, David, he's supposed to be in court in Hannibal today," Jessica said with a note of dread in her voice. "I would not have brought you here if I thought that he would show up." The man quickly walked over to the buffet, put a slice of cake on a plate, and walked over to Jessica. He gave David a quick up-and-down look, and sat down next to Jessica. "Hi babe, I made it after all," he said, sitting the cake down on the table. He offered David a handshake right across Jessica's plate. "Kevin DeWitt," he said, "attorney at law." "And you are?" "David Miller," he said, offering no more information to the newcomer. Jessica gave Kevin an uncomfortable look, and said, "I thought you were going to be in Hannibal on that armed robbery case until at least tomorrow." "Well," Kevin said in a boasting tone of voice, he was guilty as sin and they had him cold, but they made a few procedural errors that I was going to nail them on. He wouldn't have walked, but we could have appealed. They decided to take my offer. I got him for 3 years, and he's only going to have to serve 1. Jessica looked at him for a moment and said, 1 year for armed robbery. That's insane. The conversation continued, and David concentrated on deciding whether he liked this strange corn casserole dish that was on his plate. He certainly had no trouble figuring out that he very much disliked Kevin DeWitt. Following the meal, the club president called the meeting to order. "Before we introduce our program, would I believe Jessica Thomas has a guest? Would you like to introduce him to us please, Jessica?" Jessica turned 3 shades of red, and stood as the faces of the club watched expectantly. She cleared her throat and stammered, "This is David Miller," and she quickly sat down as the club members gave David a polite round of welcoming applause. "Welcome to our club, David," the president said. With a twinkle of mischief in his eye, he continued, "Would you like to tell us what brings you to our community?" Although inside he was fuming, David did his best to keep a relaxed, comfortable, and happy look on his face as he stood. He may as well get it over with, he thought. Most of these people probably know all about him from the coffee shop talk anyway. "Hello, I am here renovating Riverview House. I will be staying in the community until that project is done." He sat down amidst a rather large murmur that was running through the club. The president then introduced the program, and David pretended to watch the nervous speeches of 2 high school students who had received club scholarships. His mind was racing. It was fairly obvious she had intended mischief from the start. He stewed, and she certainly found a way to embarrass him in front of a large and influential part of the community. The bell rang, and David turned towards the door. Before he could exit, Kevin DeWitt cut him off with another handshake. "It was nice to meet you, David. Good luck on fixing that old wreck of a place up. If you ask me, it would be better to bulldoze it and put up something decent, but hey, to each their own." David smiled politely and wished DeWitt a nice day, and walked briskly out the door. While he was unlocking his car, he heard softly from behind David, "I am so sorry. I had no idea Kevin was going to be there." David turned and looked at her sharply. "What do I care if your boyfriend had lunch with you? Makes no difference to me." Inside he was screaming that he did care. "I have never seen them question a guest before," she said, her voice cracking, close to tears. "I know you don't want publicity, I just thought." "I thought. You thought wrong," David said, as he got in the car and slammed the door.